right, well, I want to thank you for hanging out so long. Being the last speaker, it's always tough to draw a crowd. So anyway, I guess I'll get right into it because we don't have a lot of time. I gave this presentation back last week, actually, at the Newburyport Library, so I apologize for anybody who already saw it. But they gave me a small window to squeeze into, so I got William Bard help me redact a lot of my presentation to make it a little bit shorter. But we'll get started. So the purpose of my presentation tonight is to basically have you understand that climate change is happening. We're responsible. It's really not a good situation, but there still is hope. I also want to give you some insights about the public's perception of climate change and also what the public's perception of the threat is. And I also want to show you where we are relative to the progression of climate change in light of the attitudes that we have about it. And ultimately, I want to give you some strategies to help you reduce your own personal contributions to the problem. So Yale has been doing a climate opinion project. They started it, I believe, in 2014, or maybe in 2012. But they've been surveying the entire United States, every county, every state, and been basically tracking people's opinions. So what do people think? Is climate change happening? And I've seen the data move, actually. We get actually a pretty good majority now, even in the countries, where 70% of the people think that the climate is changing. And it doesn't get really much better in a political survey than this. Okay, so we knew about greenhouse gases all the way back in the 1850s when they were first discovered, and scientists have pretty much been warning everyone ever since that we were going to have a problem if we kept burning fossil fuels. And this is a great article to read because we had a moment in time when scientists at the federal level in the United States had bipartisan support to do something. And unfortunately, it didn't happen because of misinformation campaign by ExxonMobil and the American Petroleum Institute. And then specifically, John Sununu, the former New Hampshire governor, when he was chief of staff, really hamstrung the entire international effort. And so it all kind of fell by the wayside, but it's a good article to read. So, the next question is it us or is it just a natural cycle? So what do people think? So most perceive that humans are the driver, but there's still a significant proportion of the population that still think it's maybe a natural cycle. So let's put that argument to rest. So what we have here, the red line, is the temperature increase globally during the industrial age. And then we're looking at the natural factors that typically have affected Earth's climate in past history. And we're looking at orbital changes of the Earth, some different solar activity, and also volcanic activity. These have all contributed to either warming or cooling of the planet. And you can see that the contribution of those factors during that time period doesn't coincide with the temperature rise. If we look at human factors, greenhouse gases are certainly tugging the temperature up, and then there are some others, like our contribution to ozone, our land use, and aerosols that are pulling it down, but when you meld all the lines together, they start to fit the curve of the temperature increase during the industrial age. And if you take the natural factors and all the human factors together, it actually welds very well with the curve that's out there. So who's responsible for climate change? Well, cumulatively, we basically are. Since 1751, we've been the leading emitter, and we've contributed most to the problem. Today, between us and China, we represent 75% of the emissions. China is mostly industry, and we're buying all of the cheap products from China due to our Western lifestyle and the lifestyle that we lead, so that's why we're the emitters. And then in terms of our own personal behavior per capita, the United States and Canada, the wealthy regions of the oil-producing countries in the Middle East, and also Australia. And if you want to look at that graphically, basically one American, in terms of their carbon footprint, is worth 2 Chinese people, 2.25 Europeans, 4 Mexicans, and 9 Costa Ricans. And to just bring that home for you, if we have a family of 5, a family of 5 in the United States generates as much carbon as 45 Costa Ricans. So we have a big impact in this country. So if it wasn't for the oceans, our temperatures, our global temperatures would already be 20 degrees hotter than what they already are. And the oceans are basically moderating the damage we're doing to our climate by acting as a giant heat sink. Most of the heat has been drawn up by the deep and the shallow areas of the oceans. And what that basically means is that there's this giant reservoir of energy being stored in the earth, and specifically in the oceans. And when we have when we introduce cold air masses from the polar regions over the warm water, we can spawn really big storms, and that has an impact for us in the coastal region. So when we look at the fossil record and go back to when we had this much heat and carbon in the atmosphere, and we look at sea levels, we see that sea level already ought to be 21 to 30 feet higher than what it already is. It's like we turned up the thermostat for water levels, but the climate furnace hasn't kicked in yet to melt the ice and expand the oceans. So it's not a question of how much water will arrive. We already know that. It's really a question of predicting when this water is going to arrive. So just look into the future, maybe 2150 and beyond. What would 20 to 30 feet of sea level rise look like in Newburyport? Well, it pretty much turns it into an island. And the barrier beaches would disappear, but they'd most likely get pushed back towards the mainland, so that Plum Island, or what would be left of it, would be where the airport is roughly. And you'd see the Little River and the Artichoke and the Merrimack River basically make a connection with that level of water, and lose the water supply. So this is way far off in the future, but it is a future nonetheless. So all this energy in the atmosphere is supercharging our weather. We're getting, monster storms. It was a big one I just pictured there. It really happened out over the ocean. We don't hear much about them because local weather only reports what the weather's going to be tomorrow. Those storms generate huge waves that affect other parts of the world. That storm generated these large waves in Portugal. Those are 90-foot cliffs, and I don't know if you can see the people standing up on the top of the cliff on the right. Also, we've had major droughts in certain areas that are becoming more like deserts. This is a picture from California in one of the reservoirs. And this isn't a thunderstorm, but this is actually the smoke from wildfires in California. And then on the other end of the spectrum, currently, we have this flooding in the Midwest from a heavy snowpack that they had this winter, and then a sudden warming and heavy rains. And there's a highway underneath that area there, and that's a truck stop. And then year-round, we have a tornado season now. It used to be mostly spring and summer. We still get tornadoes in Tornado Alley, even around Christmas time and winter. So climate change is putting more heat and energy into the system. It amplifies the contrast between the cold air masses and the warm air masses of the oceans. And it's contorting our jet stream, which governs our weather and guides it. And basically, what it's doing is it's creating extreme weather that can persist as well. So let's take a look at our own extreme weather. So remember the drought we had 2015, 2016, dried up the Ipswich River? Well, during that same period, we also had record snowfall. So we had drought and record precipitation all in the same year. It's very bipolar. Sometimes this has been a summer versus winter pattern, but other times it's actually happened within the same month, and I'm going to bring you back to October 2017. You probably don't remember it, but it was interesting to me, so I documented it, and so let's take a look. So on average, your October will be about 61 degrees in terms of an average monthly temperature. We typically have 11 rainy days and get about 4 inches of rain. And we just distribute that rain out over the month. It kind of looks like this. You get, a rainy day here and there with the passage of a cold front, maybe 2 or 3 coastal storms with a little bit more precipitation. And on average, the temperature never exceeds 70 degrees. So what happened in 2017? So the average temperature was 69, 8 degrees above the average for the month. We had 28 days that were above the average, and 15 of those days were between 70 and 80 degrees. When it came to rainfall, it looked something like this. We only had 7 days of rain, and 75% of that rain basically fell in just 3 days. So it was a really dry and hot month, but when it rained really hard. There you can visually compare the 2 months. So why did this happen? So we had this big kink in the jet stream, right? It dipped really far south over the west coast and then a major ridge up into southern Canada on the east coast. And we were parked underneath this very warm area, and that's why it was as warm as it was. Jet stream got stuck. So what do people think? Is climate change harming people in the United States, or will it? So the numbers start to get a little bit worse, right? I mean, we have 50% of the population think, maybe in 25 years, probably never will climate change harm people in the United States. So let's examine that. So while we were enjoying a nice October, what was going on over here? Well, we had this record drought in California. It killed a lot of vegetation and really did a number on the agricultural crops. And then we had wildfires start. And then following the wildfires, the jet stream moved and started channeling in a lot of moisture off the Pacific Ocean, and we ended up with copious amounts of rain on parched soil with no vegetation to suck it up or even hold the vegetation together because it had been burned. And we had massive mudslides, and we lost all of these people in one community as a result of those mudslides. Now we move ahead to this year, 2018 in November. In 2 communities, we lost another 86 people due to fire. So if we look at billion-dollar weather-related disasters, back in 1980, we used to have about 3 to 6 of those disasters. We move forward to today, and it's between 9 and 16 billion-dollar disasters in a year. Cumulatively, that's amounted to $17 trillion. And to give you an idea what 17 trillion is, if you were born and lived to be 100 years old, you'd need to earn $1.7 billion a year from the moment you were born till the day you died in order to come up with that money. And that money is being paid by the insurance companies for losses, and the insurance companies are cost shifting that into health insurance policy, car insurance, homeowners policy. Somehow it's going to get paid. It's not all going to get paid through insurance premiums. It also accounted for almost 14,000 lives, and about 3,000 of those people perished in Puerto Rico just a few years ago. So I think it is harming people in the U.S., but this is where the whole climate change problem gets to be really problematic, because what do people think about climate change harming them personally? And this is where the statistics get really bad. Most people really don't think it's going to affect them, and it's hard to motivate people to do something if they don't think it's a problem for themselves. And the attitude is, well, it's all happening somewhere else. It's California, it's Puerto Rico, it's New Orleans, it's down in New Jersey, Hurricane Sandy, but is it happening near me? So this is a picture top down looking at the North Pole. This is kind of a typical jet stream. It's a river there high up in the atmosphere, runs a ring around the top of the planet. And it'll run really fast in those dark areas and fairly straight, but then it might stall a little bit and develop some waveforms and slow down in other areas. That's fairly typical. So what happened back last year in early February? So we had this sudden stratospheric warming event in the Arctic where the temperatures rose above freezing in the middle of the winter where it's dark. And that sudden warming event really contorted the jet stream and started to mess it up. So now I'm going to rotate the globe up because we're still looking top down. And we're going to look at where we are, where the star is. And you can see that we're under this really big ridge under the jet stream like we were in October. And so what happened? February 20th and 21st, we had 71 and almost 80 degrees. People were at the beach. I saw people in bathing suits down at Plum Island because it was February vacation. And then what happened right after that? A week later, the jet stream moved and it got stuck, and we had the southern and northern branches of the jet stream merging off the Carolina coast, and we spawned a really big ocean storm. And this would be the first of about 3 or 4 storms to follow. So if you look at the wind field of that storm, and we were just really on the edges of the system, but it was a monster storm offshore, generated huge waves. Waves here were about 12 to 18 feet. And it also coincided with some really high tides. So as a result, we had flooding along the waterfront of Newburyport. We also lost access to the Plum Island Turnpike. People who lived along Reservation Terrace were probably shaking in their boots because they saw these waves splashing over what was left of their barrier dune system that had been eroding. And then we had a really weird phenomenon happen. With all this hydraulic pressure of this ocean water on either side of the island, it started to force the water table up underneath Plum Island, and we started to develop ponds between dunes and also in amongst houses and streets. And this is fairly concerning. Water sewer system aside, bathing that system in brackish water is certainly problematic, but when you start to force water up underneath the barrier beach, which is just made out of sand, you start creating channels and start destabilizing the whole structure. So in the future, this is going to be an issue. As sea level rises and keeps forcing this water table up, it's going to even enhance erosion along Plum Island even more. We had a significant surge in flooding along Water Street, Joppa, the waves were coming over the seawall, and then we had a combination of factors coming together. We had impervious surfaces up along the High Street neighborhoods, and the water was running down the streets, combining with the water coming over the seawall, which resulted in flooding along Water Street. That storm was followed by 2 more storms, which were heavy and wet snow. It resulted in power outages. I lost power for 4 days. So it was a problem for people personally and also economically. I'm going to run through this part really quickly. We're going to be releasing our resiliency planning and doing an in-depth presentation on this probably before July. But we've done basically 3 resiliency risk exercises, one sponsored by EPA, another one through National Wildlife Federation, and the third through the state of Massachusetts through the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. And basically, we've identified these risk factors, these hazards. So we get sea level rise, our coastal storms, heavy precipitation events, which could be like thunderstorms that sort of get parked over us, flooding, which could be independent of a coastal storm. You could have a lot of rain in the Merrimack River watershed, and that all comes down in our direction, just like it did during the Mother's Day storm. The atmosphere is really energetic, so wind is an issue. And then, of course, the weather extremes, which we talked about. And insect disease vectors are another hazard. We've got an epidemic of Lyme disease, West Nile virus, and some of the other mosquito-borne diseases, which are tropical in nature, are now finding their way into New England. And, of course, we all know about the combined sewer overflows in the Merrimack, and that all washes past us and along our beaches. In terms of what's vulnerable, I'm going to focus in on the critical municipal assets today. And that's our wastewater treatment plant, located in a flood zone. Also the National Grid substation, located right adjacent to that. Powers a lot of Salisbury and Newburyport. And then we have various regions and neighborhoods within the city that have their own special flood issues, and they are different. There's going to be different strategies to deal with them. And then there are community-wide vulnerabilities related to public health and safety and emergency response. And then the vulnerability of our energy grid and some of the historic buildings to wind damage. Of course, we get all these trees and power lines, so that's really a problem. And then the impervious surfaces creating localized flooding of other areas of the town because the drainage systems under our street can't handle the precipitation we get now. And then there's economic vulnerability. We're going to lose real estate on Plum Island and along the waterfront, and that's a certain percentage of our tax base. And at some point in the future, Newburyport is going to be operating without that, so what are the revenue streams going to be in the future to accommodate for those losses? In terms of sea level rise, the Resiliency Committee had a subcommittee, and we had a number of meetings and debates. We consulted the Boston Research Advisory Group, which used some of NOAA's data from the National Climate Assessment, and they produced a sea level rise scenario for Boston. We looked at emission scenarios, talked about it, basically thought that 6 feet was not unreasonable for 2100, and then basically went back through the Bragg tables and picked out the intervals. But where the rubber meets the road for Newburyport in terms of critical assets, it's going to be somewhere between 2050 and 2070. Twice a day during the daily tide, those critical assets I talked about are going to get wet, and they're not going to really be operational. So we need to have plans in place before that time arrives. But before that even happens, we're going to be tortured by storms. And the storms we have, of course, are hurricanes, right? And then our, I'm on now. Here. There we go, and northeasters. So major hurricane tracks. We've typically been on the outskirts of this track, and the reason that is because hurricane season peaks in August and September, and typically by mid-August, the jet stream, which is retreated north towards the poles during the summer months, starts to advance southward and has shunted these storms out to sea, and that's why we've typically been on the fringe. What's happening now is the jet stream is advancing southward at a later time in the season, which is why we have some of the warmer weather stretching all the way into October. So with the jet stream not showing up until mid-September to October, it gives these tropical storms more of an opportunity to ride up the East Coast and further north. So this is going to be a vulnerability for us as time goes on. When it comes to northeasters, again, everything's guided by the jet stream, and they pretty much start off to the southwest and right off to the northeast, and that's typically been the pattern. But what happens when storms start to behave outside of the box, right? We've sort of developed our infrastructure to accommodate the garden variety northeaster. I want to talk about three storms quickly that were retrograding systems, and these are storms that didn't just ride off to the northeast and away, they backed in off the ocean towards us. So we had a northeast blizzard, 78, the perfect storm in 91, and then of course Superstorm Sandy. Now Superstorm Sandy had the largest storm surge, which is kind of unusual because they all had about the same amount of wind speed, same wave heights. So why was Superstorm Sandy so much more devastating in regards to storm surge? And the reason is, the first two storms never made landfall. They came and approached our coastline, got within about 100 miles of it, and then went back out to sea. But Sandy, on the other hand, had a track like this. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why that was so devastating, but I want to point out in this picture here that had Sandy traveled just 2 more hours further north, she would have made landfall in eastern Long Island, and that would have been devastating for us, and I'll show you why. That's just a picture of Sandy barreling in towards shore. So why are we concerned about these types of retrograding storms? It has everything to do with storm surge. So when you have a storm like this out over the open ocean and you see these spiraling clouds, and they're spiraling because the wind is moving the convection. And when you look at this graphic here, the storm I just showed you, it kind of looks like a giant vortex, almost like a toilet bowl, right? Everything is spinning in towards the center. Well, the winds are spinning in towards the center, but it's also dragging all of the surface water towards the center as well. And as it gathers that surface water together, it actually starts to form a mound in the center of the storm. As you know, you can't hold water in a pile because gravity keeps pulling it down. And as long as this storm is over deep water, that's what exactly happens. The water gets gathered towards the center, and it gets flushed into the depths. It's the way the earth mixes hot surface water with the depths, and it's all part of that heat sink phenomenon of the oceans moderating their temperatures. The other thing that happens, of course, is we generate huge waves with these winds. But if you want to kind of visualize, this isn't totally accurate, there's no whirlpool in the center of the storm, but basically, this is kind of what it's doing. Now imagine taking that mass of water and with waves on top of it and moving it towards a coastline and specifically shoving it into a captive area like the Gulf of Maine, right? You can't compress water, it has to go somewhere. So when we look at that model of Sandy traveling 2 or 3 hours further north, that's exactly what would have happened. You see those dark reds would have been the wave heights in the Gulf of Maine, and underneath that would have been a massive storm surge as that storm rode ashore. And what would that have looked like? Oh gosh, I gotta go back one slide. Okay, so when Sandy came ashore, in 1 hour, she took the front of this beach and shoved it back over the dunes and on top of the marsh. This is what's known as an overwash fan. And so when you shove 10 to 15 feet of water into a barrier island, it just takes everything that's in the front and moves it to the back. Now this is a picture of a wildlife refuge, no harm, no foul there, but it also happened where there were houses, and all those houses got pushed back as well. I want to show you another picture. Oh, I'm going the wrong direction. Sorry about that. This is a picture of Salisbury Beach. You notice the patterns where the houses are built? I'll point them out for you. These are overwash fans that happened before Salisbury Beach was developed. So this had to have happened over 100 years ago, and there's not really any talk about it in the local history. But at some point, 100 years ago, these barrier beaches got overtopped in New England. And if we consider that that was a 100-year storm, it's been about 100 years. So So statistically, the time is running out. So those are the kinds of things that we are concerned about because we've got current vulnerability right now in Newburyport. So if we had a 100-year storm like that, what would that do to Newburyport? So let's just point out our critical assets. That's the wastewater plant and the National Grid facility. This is not a critical asset, it's just a catchment park area, so you can see that. Over here we have Bartlett Spring Pond and the water purification plant. And then over here we have the artichoke, the lower artichoke reservoir, the spillway along 113, the little dam you see the water run over. That already sits 3 feet below the FEMA 100-year floodplain. And the intake pipe for the entire surface water system is right there at that dam. So 75% of Newburyport's water supply is imminently vulnerable because we can't access it if that reservoir gets inundated. So if we have a surge with a 100-year storm, look at the the light green and the dark green areas. That's what we would expect to see in a storm like that. And you can see that all of those critical assets are affected. In fact, the river actually runs right into the lower artichoke, all the way up to the upper artichoke dam. So you think we have a CSO problem. What happens when you back that pristine Merrimack River water into your drinking water supply? It's a major vulnerability, and we're vulnerable right now. This is before any sea level rise happens. Also just wanted to make note of the 1936 flood. It's also almost been 100 years, but basically we had 15 inches worth of water in the snowpack up in the White Mountains. We received 15 inches of rain, and the Merrimack River flowed through the upper and lower artichoke, likely across what is now Route 95, and made a connection to the Little River in Newbury, sort of turning Newburyport into an island. Okay, so to kind of wrap this up, so where are we relative to climate change? What's the forecast? I'd like to talk about tipping points and kind of use this as an illustration to have you understand what I mean. So if you look at these two kayakers, they're not in any danger, right? We really have no concern. But if you look at the guy in the yellow kayak, and that is a sequence of him going over the waterfalls, in these two positions where he's at, he can still take corrective action and change his course, do something about it. But when he's in this position, he's already in for a ride. He's locked and loaded, right? So let's take the hockey stick climate curve and flip it upside down and make it into a waterfall. So you can see where 2020 is, right? It's kind of about where that boat is. And back in 1980, when we had an opportunity to do something in the petroleum industry and John Sununu intervened, that was the time when we could have taken evasive action and done something. So now it's really up to us to decide, do we want to take the steep ride down this curve, or do we want to shallow it and have a softer landing? Regardless, there's climate change in store for us and its effects. This is where we are now, and this is where the problems really start to arise. So I like to think about this next section in terms of, when I think about climate change and where we are relative to the problem and what society is doing about it, I think of it I think back to a roommate I had in college who started his 15-page paper the night before at midnight after a party, and the paper was due at 11 o'clock the next day. And the problem there was that we had no internet back then, the library was closed, and all we had was typewriters and didn't have word processors. What kind of a grade could he possibly have gotten, right? So we're late in the game here with climate change. So it's a matter of sort of eliminating what are the possibilities, how well can we solve this problem? Well, it's really impossible for us to get an A, right? We'd already be at net zero emissions, there would be no change in climate. In order for us to have done that, we would have had to start back in around 1980, and we let that slip by. What about a B? Well, to get a B, we would have probably had to do something around the Clinton-Gore era, and we would be on our way to, establish on a low emission scenario path, but we're not. We're actually emitting more than we ever have. So that's not possible. Is an F possible? Well, I don't think we can really strive for an F, right? Because we can't flunk Earth. There's no place else to go. So that's not really an option for us. So what would a D look like? Kind of continue on as we are, sort of slowly doing things, addressing the challenges and the disasters as they arise. We'll definitely be in for 3 degrees of warming, probably 4 or more. And we're going to see major ecosystems collapse. There are going to be large agricultural impacts. and as well as economic and societal. There can be mass migrations of people from countries and other places of the world where they just can't live anymore. It's not going to be a happy place. So really what we're looking at is a C, and a C is a steep curve. We're going to take drastic measures to limit warming to 2 degrees by 2100. The Paris goal is 1.5, so we're already giving it another half a degree. But in order to get to 2, we got to be net zero by 2050 to 2060 and be in a negative state of CO2 emissions, because we got to start pulling this stuff out of the atmosphere to start bringing the temperature back down, or at least to slowly advance. We're going to experience significant sea level rise, ecosystem impacts, and weather extremes, and we got 12 to 21 years to really pull this off, to get the policies in place. I mean, we do have the technology to do it. The question is, do we have the will, right? We're going to be ready to pull an all-nighter to get a C. So yeah, right now we don't have any leadership, and per capita, we're one of the largest emitters. So back to the frog in the pot analogy. Imagine being cooked alive and not having the brains to do anything about it. The problem is we do have the brains and we have the capability. And I want to just give you some ideas of what you can do personally. Since we're such a per capita big carbon emitting society, we all need to get on a climate, a carbon footprint calculator and figure out what our contribution is and where can we change our habits. We certainly want to divest our investments from fossil fuels, because why are you rewarding these companies that got us here in the first place? Sort of like investing in the tobacco companies. You need to put a price on carbon. We're going to start steering people away and make other forms of energy more attractive. And we especially need to vote in 2020. I mean, if we want to have change happening in 12 years, we can't afford another 4 years of what's going on now. We're going to miss another opportunity, and this is really kind of the last opportunity to actually affect us. And then you got to tell your story. I mean, part of the big problem with this, if you go to the climate opinion surveys, people aren't talking about it. It's not a conversation that most people have. And so you got to lead by example. You got to rub it off on your neighbors and your relatives and make it a social issue, because it's all about social change. We are stewards of the planet, and we need to fulfill that role. And if you don't want to save the planet, you got to at least think about saving your kids, because what are you really leaving your kids behind? What is their future going to be and the future of their grandkids? And that is the end of my presentation. I know we're a bit late and probably don't have time for questions, but if you have some, I'll entertain them. Okay, time for supper. Thanks.